sat at the cold metal table, his posture still, his eyes downcast. The dim interrogation room buzzed with the flickering hum of a dying fluorescent light overhead. Shadows clung to the corners, stretching and shifting with each uneven flicker. His silver crucifix caught the weak light, momentarily gleaming before fading back into the gloom. Across from him, a group of uniformed officers burst into laughter, their amusement sharp and cutting against the quiet. One leaned against the wall, arms crossed, a smug grin curling at the edges of his mouth. "What's that supposed to do for you?" he chuckled, nodding toward the cross hanging from Keanu's neck. His voice dripped with mockery, his colleagues echoing his amusement with jeers and snickers. Keanu remained silent. His hands rested lightly over the crucifix, fingers grazing the metal, as if drawing something unseen from its touch. His face betrayed nothing, yet behind his quiet exterior lay a sadness too deep for words. The officers continued laughing, their voices bouncing off the sterile walls, filling the small room with an oppressive weight. One of them stepped closer, planting his hands on the table, leaning in just enough for Keanu to feel his breath. "You think that thing's gonna save you?" the officer sneered. Still, Keanu did not respond. His shoulders rose and fell with slow, measured breaths. The metal chair beneath him let out the faintest creak as he shifted, but his grip on the crucifix remained steady. The laughter faded into murmurs, then silence. The officers exchanged glances, their expressions shifting, as if waiting for him to break. But Keanu Reeves did not break. The air in the room grew heavier, thick with something unspoken. The flickering light buzzed louder. And then, beyond the walls of the interrogation room, something stirred. The laughter had died down, but the smugness lingered in the officer's eyes. The one closest to Keanu tilted his head, as if trying to read something in his expression. "You got nothing to say?" he pressed, his voice carrying a forced amusement. When Keanu remained silent, the officer scoffed and pushed himself off the table. "Fine. Keep pretending. Won't matter soon." Keanu's fingers pressed lightly against the crucifix, his grip unwavering. The room felt smaller now, the air colder. A sudden noise echoed from beyond the door, a distant thud, heavy and unnatural. It was faint, but it silenced the officers almost instantly. They exchanged glances, their confidence flickering. Another thud. Closer this time. One of the officers standing near the wall straightened. "What was that?" he muttered. No one answered. The room, once filled with mocking laughter, was now thick with tension. Even the fluorescent light above seemed to hum louder, its flickering more erratic. Keanu slowly lifted his gaze. His expression hadn't changed, but something in his eyes had, a quiet knowing. The officer who had taunted him the most forced a smirk. "Probably just the old pipes," he muttered, but his voice was less certain. He turned toward the door, but before he could take a step, the lights flickered once more, then cut out entirely. Darkness swallowed the room. A second passed. Then another. The officers fumbled, the scrape of boots against the floor the only sound. Someone reached for their flashlight, but before it could click on, the door creaked open, slowly, deliberately. The hallway beyond was pitch black, but something was there, standing, watching, a presence. Keanu exhaled softly, lowering his eyes once more, his fingers never leaving the crucifix. He had told them. It was already too late. A cold draft crept into the room, carrying with it the faint scent of something metallic, something wrong. The officers stood frozen, their bravado drained in an instant. The only sound was their shallow breathing, uneven and strained. One of them, the youngest, fumbled for his flashlight. His fingers trembled as he clicked the switch. A weak beam of light cut through the darkness, shaking as he aimed it toward the open doorway. The hallway should have been empty. It wasn't. A figure stood just beyond the threshold, tall, motionless, its form barely distinguishable in the dim glow. Its presence was all-consuming, sucking the air from the room, pressing against their chests with invisible weight. The officers felt it deep in their bones, something primal, something wrong. The one who had taunted Keanu the most took an instinctive step back. "Who's there?" he demanded, but his voice cracked at the edges. No answer came. Then the light flickered. For the briefest moment, they saw it. Twisted limbs, a face shrouded in shifting shadows, eyes that weren't eyes at all, but empty voids, staring straight through them. The flashlight blinked out, plunging the room into darkness once more. A sharp gasp. Someone had been grabbed. A struggle erupted, the sound of metal scraping, chairs toppling, bodies stumbling. The officers shouted, but their voices overlapped, panicked and directionless. A sickening crunch echoed through the room, followed by a gurgled breath. Then silence. Keanu sat still. He did not flinch. His fingers remained gently wrapped around the crucifix, his head slightly bowed as if in silent prayer. Something moved beside him. Slow, deliberate. The flickering light above struggled back to life, weak and sputtering, casting erratic flashes across the room. The officers were gone. The metal table was smeared with something dark. The room smelled of copper and cold air. The only thing left in the chair across from Keanu was a single police badge, lying in a small pool of something wet. A presence lingered in the room, watching, waiting. Keanu finally lifted his eyes. "I told you," he whispered, and the light went out again. The darkness swallowed everything. The hum of the flickering light was gone. The room was silent, unnaturally so, as if sound itself had been stripped away. Keanu remained seated, his fingers still resting on the crucifix. His breath was steady, measured, untouched by the terror that had just unfolded around him. Then a whisper. Not from him, not from the doorway, from everywhere. Low, guttural, crawling along the edges of reality. It carried no language, yet its meaning was clear. A presence that had been waiting, watching, now speaking. Keanu exhaled through his nose, tilting his head slightly, listening. Another whisper. Closer. Something shifted in the darkness just beyond the edge of perception. The scent of metal thickened, heavy and suffocating. The chair across from him screeched as it moved, scraping against the cold floor. Then, a breath. Right beside his ear, Keanu turned his head slightly, not in fear, not in defiance, just acknowledgement. "You got what you came for," he murmured. Silence. Then slowly, the fluorescent light above flickered back to life, just barely, dim and weak. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, twisting and coiling like living things. The metal table in front of him was empty now. The badge, the blood, gone. The door to the interrogation room stood open, revealing the hallway beyond. It was no longer the sterile police station it had been before. The walls were cracked, peeling, as if abandoned for years. The air was thick with dust, the distant echo of dripping water the only sound. The station was gone. Or perhaps he had been moved somewhere else. Keanu finally rose from his chair, his movements unhurried. He adjusted the crucifix around his neck, his fingers lingering on the metal for just a moment, before he stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the decayed hallway. Behind him, the interrogation room remained unchanged, a single light buzzing. An empty chair. The echo of laughter that no longer belonged to anyone. Keanu walked forward, his footsteps silent. Something had come for them, but it hadn't come for him. Not yet.